ask you, Tony Gosselin. The Russian Foreign Intelligence Chief has come out and said this is no longer a Cold War, but it's a hot war for us. How do you see it, Tony Gosselin?
Well, I noticed one of my old colleagues on RT, Mark Sloboda, he is a US analyst based in Moscow, at Moscow, one of the big Moscow universities, and he's calling it the great decoupling. I would totally agree. What's happened here is, and your initial question is about, the difference between the Russian version of events and the Western version of events. Well, what we've seen really is two completely different narratives coming out through the media, the mass media, depending on which side of the divide you are. And the most significant fact for me as a journalist watching this is to see the lights going out around the West of the RT channel. So basically when people switch it on, there's just a blank screen. This has already begun to happen on most of our major television platforms. And this is extremely dangerous. And if you look at what happened back in the Second World War in the 1930s and the 40s, the British were confident enough in the righteousness of their cause against Nazi Germany. Obviously, there were many other countries in the United States and other European countries involved in that, not least of which is the Poles. We were confident enough to make sure that the Nazi propaganda coming out of Radio Luxembourg in English, broadcast to the whole of Britain, was not interrupted. So we had the belief that truth and justice and righteousness was on our side. What bothers me is by shutting down RT, what's happening is there is basically a disconnect going on in the Western elites, saying we're not interested in, we do not believe, we are actually afraid of the analysis that's coming from Russia. And obviously as journalists, we want to see, hear and present both sides, as I try to do on my regular podcast every Friday, both sides of the discussion, both sides of the argument. And as soon as you start to lose that, I believe you're beginning to lose the war. And by cutting off the balanced analysis and the ability to actually hear what the opposition is saying, you are setting yourself down on the route towards a much bigger war. And that's what bothers me most about this, is there's very little going back once you've decided that you're going to demonize the enemy and you're not going to listen to any of their quite reasonable concerns. And Putin was absolutely clear in his speech last Thursday morning that they see the increasing militarization of Ukraine as an existential threat to Russia as a state. So he believes it's life and death for the Russian state. And of course, they have to do something about that. Whether this is the right response is another question.
Okay, let's find out what some of our online viewers think about this. We're going to turn to some social media posts now. Our first post, amid NATO and EU expansion, Putin reaction was expected. Russian sovereignty is at risk. Economy and all other related things comes later. Real handler of Orange Revolution are EU and the US. Ukraine is being used by the West. Next, Russia should not infringe on Ukraine's sovereignty and territory, but NATO also should not threaten Russia's national security with 5 consecutive rounds of eastward expansion. Sanctions will not help end the war, and the only hope for peace is negotiation. Britain and the collective West must stay out of Ukraine. Russia insisted on no eastward expansion of NATO and EU, and when Zelensky shouted that he wanted nuclear and the West applauded, the Russian bear was poked. We do not want World War III. On a final social media post, now the ball is actually in NATO's court. Call a meeting with Russia and sign an agreement that there will be no further expansion east. This, according to Putin, ends the war with Ukraine. All he wants is Russia's security from NATO and the US. Okay, some of the social media posts there. Jan Oberg, Russia has said that they're not interested in having a government there that they are going to control. The West doesn't seem to think so. They have said that time and again. When you take a look at the way that Russia wants to proceed from the time that they, if they take control of their military objectives or obtain their military objectives, do you think that then the government there is going to be a government that is going to be independent? Because we know back in 2014 that was a democratically elected government until you had obviously foreign interference there, in which the U.S. was part of.
You might formulate it this way: Putin, in that case of your scenario, would do tit for tat of what was done by the West basically in 2014, when there was a regime change financed and orchestrated by American diplomats in Kiev. I think there's something else that should be said here, and that goes along with what Tony Gosling said. I feel increasingly, I have felt the last 20 years, this is nothing new, that the West is so weak morally and intellectually, not militarily, that it cannot accept diversity in our media, that it cannot accept more narratives coexisting and talking with each other. This began to a certain extent during the Yugoslav wars 25 years ago. I experienced it very strongly myself when I had been to Syria. It was not possible to publish one article or one of my photos in the Western mainstream press. So there's nothing new in that. And it has also to do with the fact of what I call security intellectual disarmament, the only disarmament we have had. And that is, people don't read books anymore. Ministers do not know the basics of deterrence theory. People do not know anything about security, common security. It's not an intellectual process before decisions are made in ministries of foreign affairs. They spend the money not on expertise, but on marketing and selling arguments. And most politicians know, and I say this with 45 years of experience in this field, know too little at the same time as they are handling questions about the humanities' survival. That makes me frightened way above or beyond what Putin is doing or the West is doing. And I think that is something that has paved the way for the one-dimensional thinking. We are at the level intellectually now where this, what we're talking about here, Ukraine, is no longer considered a conflict with two parties. It's considered one party who is innocent and who is harassed by Russia as the evil party that must now be punished. And my final word on that is the reaction to the invasion. The uniformity of the reaction in the West is, to me, more worrying than the invasion in its long-term consequences. I think what the West is now will do the next few years, is to suffocate economically, politically, and otherwise Russia, and get a regime change like in Kiev in 2014 in Russia.
All right, I got less than a minute that I can give to you, Tony Gosling. You used the word decoupling. We were looking at a multipolar world. This is surely going to test the definition of a multipolar world, because I'm guessing for sure Russia is going to turn more eastward. Are we looking at a economic stranglehold that the West is imposing on Russia, that Russia can therefore think it's going to withstand, and therefore ultimately China is looking at all of this, taking some lessons to then withstand what may be coming its way?
Well, look, the real economic victims are not Russia. They are the Western populations. It's us that's going to have to see our energy prices virtually doubling. And as we watch the big oil companies, the multinationals, the transnationals, profits also doubling. So there are a lot of people in the West, the sort of transnational corporations are extremely happy. But look, I did a poll on my Twitter feed about Ukraine and whether it is really a sovereign country. And it's just closed over 3 days. 90% of the respondents say no, it's not a sovereign country, and it hasn't been since 2014. So this is what's happening. We're getting told in the press here, oh, it's a sovereign country, it's a sovereign country. This word is repeated again and again. And they're basically selling the Ukrainian government and Zelensky like this, trying to sell soap powder. And I'm afraid in the end of the day, with the boots on the ground, etc., this is not going to cut anything. And also the economic impoverishment that this is going to bring the West, particularly Europe, is going to help turn the populations. So I believe.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we just fresh out of time, but thank you for that. Tony Gosling, historian, and journalist Jan Oberg, a pleasure, founder of transnational.live from Lund. With that, we come to an end for this news review.